So there's been kind of renewed calls for more uh, domestic terrorism laws to be put in place in the U.S. after that attempted insurrection or attempted coup attempt at the Capitol January 6th. And that is definitely not the direction that we need to be going in right now. Um, though, because those so-called anti-terrorism laws, whether they be domestic or abroad, are always violated and used against more or less people on the left, people protesting for Black Lives Matter, people protesting against Wall Street, against war, against imperialism, against environmental destruction, and they will always be used and abused to target enemies of the U.S. So I think this is something that if you're on the left, if you consider yourself a progressive, we should all be voicing our opposition to. So this is from The Intercept. Capitol Hill assaults revive calls for domestic terrorism law, but civil liberties groups are wary. Before we go down this road again, we should think very carefully about whether new authority is actually needed and how they might be abused. I mean, for God's sakes, we live in the most surveilled country in the history of the world, and we already have all these hugely draconian laws in place in our criminal and justice system. There's more than enough laws on the books to keep so-called domestic terrorists, to hold them accountable when they engage in domestic terrorism. More laws, giving more powers to the state, giving them more authoritarian overreach. That's not going to help anything. That's ridiculous. Let's see. However, Trump leaves office, a new Congress appears poised to revive a years-old debate on whether the U.S. should expand the legal framework for going after domestic terrorism. A group of former Justice Department officials, along with FBI agents association, has long argued that current laws make it easier to prosecute ideologically motivated acts of violence as terrorism if they appear to be inspired by a foreign terror organization like the Islamic State. I think it always needs to be pointed out when we're talking about the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, that they were literally created in Iraq after the U.S.'s illegal, disgusting war and subsequent occupation that created a power vacuum in Iraq after they took Saddam Hussein out of power. But civil liberties advocates are wary of such a move, noting that federal law enforcement already has powerful tools to investigate and prosecute acts of domestic terrorism without any new laws, and that importing the anti-terrorism framework risks creating broad and vague powers that would be used to go after activists or religious minorities. Yes, look how the Muslim community has been targeted since 9/11. Look how, I mean, Jesus Christ, you're off your rocker, in my opinion, if you are in support of giving the U.S. government more power to surveil and control people. I mean, for God's sakes, like I said, we're already the most surveilled country in the history of the world. Literally anything you type on your phone, on your computer, you post on social media, NSA, CIA, security state has access to. Is that really? Like, what else do they fucking need? I mean, god damn. Anyone familiar with the scope of surveillance, targeting of Black political dissent or Muslim communities knows that law enforcement has all the tools it needs to aggressively disrupt and hold accountable those who planned and participated in the storming of the Capitol, said Diala Shamas, a staff attorney with the Center for Constitutional Rights. Why didn't they raise serious questions? But it was not because their hands are tied. We don't need a new terrorism designations. It's not yeah, exactly. Their hands were tied. It's that the powers that be either didn't take this threat of this, insurrection or coup attempt seriously, or they just didn't care. Maybe a combination of both. They have plenty an overabundance of resources for this type of thing, should they so choose to use it. I mean, Jesus Christ. I think Biden, given his law and order nature, probably would support it. November, the Wall Street Journal reported that an informal group of advisors had suggested that Biden step up efforts to counter extreme. You know what a good way to counter extremism is? Would be to advocate for things that improve the material conditions of the working class, like a Green New Deal, like an eco-socialist Green New Deal, like canceling student loan debt, like providing Medicare for all so everybody has health care, a wealth tax, etc. I mean, really want to combat extremism, find and advocate like hell for programs that uplift the material conditions of the working class, which are huge and continuing to expand right now, unfortunately. On his campaign website, Biden promised to work for a domestic terrorism law that respects free speech and liberties, while making the same commitment to root out domestic terrorism as we have to stopping international. Again, there's more than enough laws, and the authorities have more than enough fucking resources to combat this shit, should they so choose. I mean, it's ridiculous. Looks like Biden hasn't taken a position on whether domestic terrorism should be a federal crime or what statute should look like, and declined to further comment. Biden was calling them insurrectionists, domestic terrorists, the people who stormed the Capitol in that insurrection attempt. In U.S. terrorism prosecutions, the defendant isn't charged with domestic terrorism or international terrorism directly. In fact, U.S. law didn't have a definition of domestic terrorism until October 2001. Most terrorism prosecutions rely on broadly constructed charges of material support for international terror groups, even if the defendants have few direct ties to those networks. Sayfullo Sayapov, for example, an Uzbek immigrant who drove a truck down a bike lane in downtown Manhattan, killing 8 people, was charged with providing material support to ISIS after claiming its cause as own, despite having no further ties to the group. Interesting. So here we go. The FBI has since 9/11 gained extraordinary authorities to investigate. In order to open an assessment, the lowest level of investigation, the only thing that the FBI needs to have is an authorized purpose, said Faiza Patel, co-director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. Given the fact that there are less than 50 statutes that count as domestic terrorism, there are at least, I should say, I feel confident that they could find an authorized purpose. They've certainly done that when they have gone after Muslims and other minority communities. The terrorist label is also vulnerable to political exploit. Yes. Pointing to Republicans' use of terrorism language to describe Antifa last summer. And then you already have some fucking people on the right saying, "Oh yeah, these weren't Trump supporters. These weren't MAGA diehards. They were actually, it was Antifa. They were responsible for all of the violence and mayhem at the Capitol." Oh, Jesus. Yeah, look, Trump wanting to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. And then Bill Barr. The violence instigated and carried out by Antifa and other similar groups in connection with the rioting is domestic terrorism. Look, so yeah, again, you give the government more leeway, more power, more leverage to label whoever they want as domestic terrorism. They're going to do that. It'll be used in a politically motivated way. Again, 50 statutes already relating to domestic terrorism on the books. That is more than enough. And then Schiff tried to introduce this anti-terrorism law in 2019, which the ACLU came out against. So here we go. ACLU opposed the bill in part because they said it would give broad discretion to the attorney, like Bill Barr labeling people protesting against fascism as terrorists. We think we want to give that power to the next Bill Barr, right-wing reactionary attorney generals? Fuck no, and you're nuts to think otherwise. Our attorney general to decide when to prosecute offenses of terrorism. Balzakis said that Schiff bill had built-in checks that could prevent abuse, including a requirement that prosecutions be reviewed by the Independent Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. If that statute had been enacted last summer, Patel said Attorney General Barr would have had the discretion to treat property damage from anti-racism protests as terrorism. And I don't think we want to leave that kind of discretion to the Attorney General, even when you trust the Attorney General. Exactly. Lawmakers should think carefully about applying any broad new legal frameworks for terrorism, given how far-reaching post-9/11 measures turn out to be. Jamil Jaffer, executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute, told The Intercept by email. Many of the intelligence and law enforcement authorities that were created or expanded after 9/11 were expanded with Al-Qaeda in mind. Al-Qaeda. That is, with the idea that these new authorities were necessary to address the threat presented by a relatively small number of committed terrorists based overseas, Jaffer wrote. But those expanded authorities ended up having dramatic implications for the lives and liberties of millions of people both inside and outside the United States, the vast majority of whom had absolutely nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. Before we go down this road again, we should think very carefully about whether new authorities are actually needed, how those authorities are likely to be used, and how they might be abused. It is important to remember that all of the authority we invest in this administration will be available to every future administration as well. I mean, it's a fair point. And then here is the ACLU on that bill that Schiff introduced in 2019. ACLU statement opposing HR 4192. Here we go. By reifying and broadening domestic terrorism authorities, HR 4192 would unnecessarily expand law enforcement authorities to target and discriminate against the very communities Congress is seeking to protect. Okay? People of color and other marginalized communities have long been targeted under domestic terrorism authorities for unfair and discriminatory surveillance, investigations, and prosecutions. Law enforcement agencies' use of these authorities undermines and has violated equal protection, due process, and First Amendment rights. Okay? We don't need more draconian laws in place. We don't need more anti-terrorism laws. We don't need to give the FBI, the CIA, or NSA, any apparatus that's connected with the security state, more power. There's already more than enough statutes and things in place to combat domestic terrorism when it does in fact happen in the U.S. We don't need to be giving the government any more leeway to take away any more of our civil liberties that have already been drastically reduced since 9/11. Those are my thoughts. Share yours in the comment sections down below. Subscribe for more content. If you like the video, like the damn video. Peace. Much love.